Longtime activist, trailblazer, and former state representative Mel King died yesterday. King's daughter tells WBZ he died in his home in the South End. He served 5 terms as a state representative and became the first black person to run for mayor of Boston in 1983. While he didn't win, his campaign still helped unite the city during a time when race relations were tense. He was also a teacher and a community activist. Mel King was 94. And joining me now to talk about his life is WBZ TV political analyst John Keller. And I know, John, you posted a great piece about Mel King and the effect that he left on Boston through his work that a lot of younger people might not fully appreciate now. And how do you put into context how transformative he was?
Well, I mean, I know we're going to talk about the 1983 mayoral race more in a moment, but let me sort of start at the beginning by way of answering your question, Paula. Mel King was raised in a part of the South End known as the New York Streets. Remember where the old Herald building was on Albany Street? Yep. Now it's high-rise condos and so forth. That was a neighborhood, about 20 square blocks of tenements, mom and pop businesses, a lot of low-income people living there, including the King family. And by the mid-1950s, it was gone. Really Boston's first urban renewal project, although from the point of view of King and many others, urban destruction is more like it. And that experience of seeing his childhood neighborhood wiped out in the name of commerce was certainly a key formative factor in Mel King's outlook and energizing his activism over the course of the years, a lot of which was focused on the South End. Many years later, if you know the Tent City apartment complex across the street from the Back Bay Station, that was developed as affordable housing after very vocal protests led by Mel King back in the 1970s. So this sense of deprivation that afflicted many black and poor people in the city, of being behind the 8 ball when it came to exercising political power, and a burning desire to do something about all that is really what Mel King brought to the table and is the lion's share of his legacy. Yeah,
it's interesting to put it in context because people, I think, know a lot about how Boston's West End was completely obliterated. And so someone growing up in the South End would see the danger of that happening to their community.
This was before that.
And this was before that. For people my age, he first emerges on the scene. I was in high school when he ran for mayor of Boston. He was a constant presence in the news cycles. It was 1983. And he had been an activist. And of course, we had come through busing in the 70s, the darkest days in Boston of the most hideous images broadcast around the country. And then he comes in to campaign for mayor in 1983. And you take it from here about how he really survived through some tough racial circumstances while campaigning.
Well, you don't need me to tell you, stop any black Bostonian. They'll tell you about how tough it can be, not just in the past, but in the present day, although things certainly have gotten better, to be black in Boston. But, you know, for Mel King, growing up in the 40s and 50s, it was especially tough. I remember, and I wrote about on CBSBoston.com, going out, following him around for an article I was writing on his 1983 mayoral campaign. And he was campaigning in East Boston. We were walking past a local school, and two young boys, couldn't have been more than 10, might have been as young as 7 or 8, came up to him and said, "Hey, you're Mel King, right?" He said, "Yes." And one of them proceeded to unleash a string of vile racial epithets at Mr. King, culminating with a command that he get the bleep out of East Boston. And, you know, I was shocked. But King kind of glanced at me, imperturbable, and just continued with what he was doing. Nothing new for him in that experience, just to give you, you know, a sense. And this is 1983 now we're talking about.
And they were children.
And and they were children. So, you know, this is kind of what he was up against. In spite of all that, he didn't get discouraged. He pushed to organize, to consolidate black political clout. That was reflected in him making the mayoral runoff in 1983. First time a person of color had ever done that. And then that 1983 race was so pivotal because not just the way it unfolded, but what happened afterward.
Well, it is interesting because people who grew up in the greater Boston area know Kevin White, being mayor from 1967, 68 through the early 80s, is sort of given the title that he ushered in the new Boston, right? That he was the bridge from the old pre-war period to modern Boston. But you point out in what you wrote, Ray Flynn in that mayoral race and his friendship with Mel King really ushered in the new Boston.
Kevin White, in many ways a great mayor, was sort of known on the street as the mayor of downtown. It was under his watch that the decrepit Faneuil Hall Market area was revitalized into the Quincy market that we know of today. And both Ray Flynn, coming out of South Boston, and Mel King, coming out of the South End, were much more focused on neighborhood development. The neighborhoods felt neglected by City Hall in favor of downtown and the wealthy high-rises, the wealthy people in the high-rises.
And people who had fled for the suburbs.
And right. And that's right. A lot of the middle class, people with the money to do so, had fled from the suburbs, fled to the suburbs. So both of them, although ideologically they couldn't have been more different.
Sure.
Flynn was quite conservative. Mel King was very liberal, even radical in some ways. They both shared this sort of neighborhood populism, this sense that power needed to be returned to the neighborhoods, that grassroots activism was a way to affect change, and that the wealth of downtown needed to be shared more by the working class and middle class people remaining in the neighborhoods. And while they ran hard against each other, Ray Flynn won by a big margin, but they kept it, they were sharp elbows. Let's not sugarcoat it.
But they showed respect for each other.
They showed respect for each other because they shared that populist bond. And also personally, they got along quite well. On election night, both men couldn't have been more gracious toward one another. And they made a point of showcasing that friendship in the months and years that followed, really setting an example for the emergence of the Boston we see today.
It certainly looms large. I don't have memory of the, all of the various details, but I remember that, how big of a moment it was for the city of Boston.
And, if Ray Flynn were a lesser man, or if Mel King had been a lesser man, perhaps the outcome wouldn't have been different. The results wouldn't have been so positive. But when you look at the emergence of really a pretty progressive consensus in Boston city management, think, Tom Menino to Marty Walsh to Michelle Wu. Those are three, by any measure nationally, those are three pretty progressive mayors we've had. This is all part of the seeds that were planted by people like Mel King and Ray Flynn back in the day. But the thing about Mel King that I'll always remember was the last time I saw him. A few years ago, I covered an MBTA board meeting where there were some controversial issues on the agenda. And there in the front row was, I would say at that point, 90-year-old Mel King with his cane, sitting in the front row waiting for the public comment period. He was there as an activist on some issue of importance to the community. So during a break, I went over, I asked him if he remembered me, and he said, sure.
You're unforgettable, John.
Well, listen, this guy was unforgettable. I'll be forgotten soon after I retire, I'm sure. But I said to him, and I meant it too, I said, you look fantastic. How do you do it? What's your secret? And he just looked up at me and he kind of smiled and he said, love. And I think that kind of says it all about Melvin King.
And you also say he wrote several books, and you can really learn more about how he thought by reading what he wrote.
One book in particular, Chain of Change, it was called. It was a look at the emergence of black political power in Boston. Came out in 1981. I'm sure, I don't know how hard it is to find these days, but I bet if you look for it online, you can find it. But I would urge anyone who wants to know more about who this man was and how he came across, go on YouTube. There's a lot of video of him out there, and watch some of his concession speech from '83, some of his other speeches. I think you'll come away with an understanding that, Boston can be a rough-edged town. And particularly when it comes to politics, it can be a rough place. The people can be rough sometimes, but deep down inside, the true Bostonian has a lot of class and a lot of love to give and to share, and Mel King, in my view, epitomized that.
Yeah. And of course, our condolences go out to his family.
Absolutely.
What a proud legacy he left on the city of Boston.
May his memory be a blessing.
John Keller, thank you so much.
Thank you.